I guess we'll go ahead and get started because it's just after 1 and we've got got all our panelists. And if anyone else shows up, they can join us. We are recording so that we can share it with other folks in the graphic memoir group who may not be able to make it today. So yeah, I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about why I organized this panel and then dive in. So I organized this panel with help from Tom because I'm deep in the process of making a book that's forthcoming from Street Noise Books in 2025. And my book, Reboot, is a story about how my life fell apart after an unexpected trigger and what it really took to rewire myself. I basically I think we make this work because we're pulled, we're compelled to. And I think actually a quote from Tessa's book sums it up really well. Our ghost needed someone to freely give her voice and hands to the telling of their story. They needed me to feed them by bearing witness, by releasing us all into the light. And I think that when we're working on these kinds of projects that are about trauma and really vulnerable experiences, it's no easy task to make a graphic memoir because you're sorting through that material. And so I'm really hoping today that we'll learn from panelists' reflections and wisdom and regrets, all of it. So our panel today includes Beth Trembley, who is the author of Look Again, Erin Williams, who's the author of Commute, an illustrated memoir of shame, Natalie Norris, who wrote Dear Minnie, Tessa Hulls, who wrote Feeding Ghosts, which just was recently released, right? Like about maybe 2 weeks ago, Tessa, is that right?
About 3, yeah, I'm still out on book.
Okay. And Tom Hart, the author of Rosalie Lightning. And I was hoping that panelists could start by giving a brief introduction to yourself and like a little book blurb for us all. And then we'll go to some specific questions and then kind of open up to general questions. Maybe starting, I see Tom right next to me on the screen. So Tom, if you're intro and then.
Oh, Cara. An introduction of ourselves in our book or something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
I made a book about so hard to talk about even still. So excuse my pausing. My 2-year-old daughter died suddenly in 2011. And I did a book about it. What else are you going to do? And that took about 3 or 4 years, and it came out in January 2016. There. Who's next, Cara?
Beth, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Beth Trembley. About myself, really, I guess what I like to say to people in the comics world is that I didn't do comics until I was, over 50. I'm a novelist and creative writing teacher. Prior to that point, in my 50s, I decided I really, really, really wanted to work in comics instead. I've always loved them and taught them, but hadn't ever done it. Couldn't draw, decided I could teach anybody to write better, so I could probably get help learning to draw better. Found Tom and the Sequential Artists Workshop and have gone from there. The book Look Again, which came out in the fall of 22, is a graphic memoir that tells that examines how it is that we deal with trauma. And so the trauma happens in the first few pages of the book. I found a dead body while I was walking in the woods. And then the book is about the subsequent 20 years of my trying to deal with my guilt and shame about how I reacted that day and even subsequent days after I had that trauma and that fright. Because it was not just finding the dead body. I actually thought I'd interrupted a murder and that they were still there. And so it's really about reconciling myself to how I responded in the moment of trauma.
Natalie, would you be willing to introduce yourself? And your book?
Sure. I'm Natalie. I am a cartoonist. I'm up here in Vermont. I work at the Center for Cartoon Studies, where I also went to school. So I work in the library, which is a great way to get to see. I read most of your books through the library. And yeah, I came to comics a few years ago, and I always knew that I wanted to make some kind of a memoir. I did like creative writing and studio art in college, but I was sort of torn between the two, and I wanted to find a way to merge them because I really had stories I wanted to tell, but it wasn't like it didn't feel satisfying enough for me to do that just in words. I knew that I needed to like bring in images because that's like really where my like heart is. And so yeah, I found out about comics kind of late in terms of, I don't know, some people are reading them all through adolescence. And then yeah, I did my first book, Dear Minnie. It's the first part of like a two-part book. It's this guy. And yeah, it's a story that takes place during my adolescence, and it's written in the form of a letter to my friend Minnie, who I only knew or I only spent about 3 weeks with her, and she is Austrian, and so the majority of the book takes place in Austria, and the story has like a number of sexual assaults, but it does focus primarily on this one traumatic, I mean they're all traumatic, but a particularly traumatic experience of rape when I was in Austria. And that was something I didn't tell anyone about, so making this book really was sort of one of the first times that I put the whole story together. And I started this book 9 years I think after this had happened, 8 or 9 years, and it came out. I had to change some of the numbers in the book that says like, oh, this happened 12 years ago by the time it came out. Yeah, so this just came out in July of last year, so it still feels kind of fresh.
Tessa, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Tessa Hulls. My book Feeding Ghosts just came out about 3.5 weeks ago. And so I've been on the road for a month, and I'm doing this from my cousin's office in outside of Boston. And so Feeding Ghosts is the one story I spent my whole life running from, because I grew up in a family that had a lot of really dark history. My grandmother was a journalist in Shanghai and got put through Maoist era thought reform, and it broke her mind. And so basically I use the story of what happened to my grandmother and then my mother after they had to flee China to teach about 100 years of Chinese history, while also sort of braiding in how that left me with a really broken relationship with my mother, and how I became a very hyper independent cowboy to get away from that all. So basically spent my 20s knowing eventually I would have to tell this story, and came back as a prodigal daughter to begin that process just after I turned 30, and taught myself how to be a graphic novelist for that one project. So Beth and Natalie, I love that there's a bunch of us on here who came to this later. And yeah, my background was mostly as a painter. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about like coming in with a different perspective and how you have to unlearn to become a comics artist.
Erin, would you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, I'm Erin Williams. I have written and illustrated 10 books, two of them are graphic memoirs-ish. And I teach illustration at Parsons School of Design in New York, and I teach writing at Hunter College. And I also came very late to comics. When I started writing Commute, I'd never read a graphic novel before. And so when someone suggested I turn it into a graphic novel, I had to start reading them. But this is Commute. So this came out in 2019. This is about sexual assault flashbacks triggered by my daily commute to and from Manhattan for work. And then my new one is called What's Wrong. This came out in January, and this is about chronic pain and illness and the failures of American healthcare. And it is my trauma, but also other people's trauma, which was a really different beast to contend with in my work. And I'm so glad to be here. So thanks, Cara.
Thank you all. This is awesome. So I actually wanted to start with a different question, but now because of what everybody's saying, I'm going to kind of pivot, and I'm curious about everybody's saying they're late to comics. Well, maybe not Tom, but that. So I'm kind of curious about maybe if we could start with like, why comics? Like, why comics for this work that is like really compelling all of us to tell these stories that we feel like we have, that we've been like either running from or but now feel like we have to tell them in order to somehow reach some satiation or relief in some way. Yeah, I'm curious, like, why comics and why not another medium? Beth, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah. So my plan was to write middle grade fantasy comics because I love them so much. And, you know, I'd written murder mysteries and that was all fun, and scholarship, which was never fun for me anyway. And so I just wanted to do something that was super fun. And I loved, you know, the Lunch Lady books by Jarrett Krasaska. That was my plan, right? I had the plan, the plot outlines, the characters, all that stuff. And I started taking comics classes the first one I took was Comics for Writers that Saw has, because I was a writer, right? And as it says in the book, I was sketching around one day, and before I even realized what I had done, I drew what I had seen that day. Like I drew the guy in the woods. And what happened to me physically, and I guess intellectually, emotionally, whatever, as I looked at that picture, right? I mean, I was drawing space aliens, you know, for my book, and German shepherds, and out came this thing. And I almost literally, you said rewired earlier, Cara, felt something in my brain just go ka-chunk, because I was seeing out here for the first time in 20 years, the thing that I had only seen for a few seconds before I started running, that had haunted me all that time. And oh shoot, so sorry. Now I can't remember who said it, but a minute ago, somebody said something about witnessing. Oh, I know, you were quoting Tessa about the need to witness. And for me, that was what I suddenly realized. I mean, I just felt such an incredible shift in that second that I thought, well, this is what I have to draw. And heck, I already know this story. It'll be an easy way for me to practice comics, because I've told the story so many times. I'll just learn my chops in comics, retelling this story, and then I'll go back to the fun stuff. That's my plan.
Maybe it didn't work out quite like that.
It
Did you go
did.
back to the fun stuff?
No. Well, yes, I'm working on a book on Batman right now, so super fun. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I had no idea what was going to come ripping out once I started on that.
I can jump off of that. I think that for me, the trauma was stored so much in my visual brain, and it was so difficult to talk about. And there was something that almost felt like futile about trying to talk about it, or like needlessly gratuitous if you did try and explain sort of like the scene. And it's funny because I found later in my diary from shortly after the assault, where I said I didn't want to put those images in anyone's head. That's why I wasn't going to tell anyone. And I think it's just like interesting that it's like it was the images, it wasn't like the ideas, it was the images that were so hard for me to carry. And so I didn't want to put that on someone. And then, of course, it ended up being the thing that I sort of had to exercise from myself. But it has made it a really complicated thing in terms of them putting it into the world and sharing it, because there is still that part of me that was like, we were going to never do that. And then we did the exact thing that we promised ourselves we'd never do. So yeah, I think that that's been something that I've been wrestling with but also just comics in general, the way that they work, I think really lends itself to capturing memory because it doesn't have to be seamless like a movie. Like you're showing these fragments. And so often with trauma, the things, the sequence itself, like I could remember everything that happened, and yet there was this lack of like cohesion of like any type of meaning. And it was like all these different mini events, is what it sort of felt like. And so then to actually put it down, I could draw it in the same way I remember it, just these little fragments, but then it gets synthesized as a whole. Yeah.
Comics are really have like so much power with that because of panels and then the gutters. So you have that space and you can skip and jump in time and then play with things and how the page is designed. Yeah, there's so much power in that.
Yeah, I think there's this other element too. I mean, this isn't like why I came into it, but it's something that I thought about a lot later. There's, especially when you're like for so many of these topics, like I think that the work acts in a way, the work functions as testimony. And so there's something really powerful in drawing attention to the reader as witness of testimony. And I feel like that's particularly true. I identify with that particularly like in terms of sexual assault work, because there's so little testimony, and the testimony that happens matters so little. Like I always think of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings or whatever. That's like my ultimate trigger. But also with something like, I mean, I imagine like what Tessa was talking about too, like where you are really creating an archive, you are creating visual and written testimony, and you're forcing the reader to literally see from your perspective. And there's something really empowering in that, in saying like, you can only see what I'm going to show you.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, because it's a perfect segue, the reason that I chose to do this as a graphic novel is because it forces the viewer to see history as a series of things that happen to people. It takes it out of this realm of dates, and it really allows you to show how the microcosm is contained within the macrocosm. And so I knew that only a graphic novel would really allow me to be able to make the sort of jarring time jumps that I wanted to, because in each section of my book, it's jumping between the present, the past, and like 6 different timelines. And the ability to basically throw yourself in as a guide, you can do that without losing your reader if they have that visual continuity, if like you marching through, showing them sort of what the through lines are, and you can't do that in text.
I'm so curious about this whole phenomenon too, about like this opportunity to be witnessed and to witness ourselves and to witness others through comics. And also like Erin, I think you used the word testimony, which is like super powerful, like thinking about like the various aspects of that witnessing. So we're witnessing ourselves in making this work, witnessing like our stories and our history, and then asking others to witness too. And I guess like through that process, like I'm curious if you can talk about like what is that experience like of like witnessing yourself through the process of making this work. And then I guess I'll have a follow-up question maybe also about what is it like then to see your work witnessed, and to kind of interact from that perspective? Does that make sense? I feel like I just asked a really convoluted question. I'm happy
Makes sense to me.
to.
I'll just say that it's horribly re-traumatizing. Making the work sucks. I found writing to Commute to be like incredibly difficult, incredibly traumatizing. Natalie and I were just on a mocha panel together talking about this exact thing. Like, it is not cathartic at all to make comics about your trauma. It is horrible. And yeah, exactly. That is exactly what I was talking about on my MoCA panel, is this essay called Against Catharsis by T. Cara Madden, which you can find online. And yeah, I lost my train of thought, but no, it is very, very, very difficult to make work about it. And I think that what T. Cara Madden says is that it's cathartic for the reader, not for the writer or comics maker.
I feel like my process was very like up and down, where there were definitely yeah, it's like it would move in and out of being like super re-traumatizing to then also this feeling of relief of having externalized something. And I think there is this sort of magic with comics that you can transform something really horrible into something aesthetically beautiful. And so I would often like fall back on that because I painted my book, and so I found that like in the painting stage, like in a way it was almost like meditative, and you're reframing it in your brain as not just this traumatic memory, but as something now that is a piece of art. Um, I think I feel like there were multiple parts to this question. What was the other?
Maybe we can hold the part about what it's like to then have your work witnessed by other people, because that almost feels like a separate.
Right, but then the witnessing yourself, I think that was really important for me, because especially like with dissociation, like you can know something happened to yourself, but it doesn't really feel like it happened to you or it happened to this other version. And I think what was weird about comics is that it's both like sort of the epitome of disembodiment and embodiment, because you're drawing yourself as like a little avatar, so it's not you. And yet like I did my book in chunks, so I would like finish a scene, like a chapter, and then I would just spend hours over the next few days or weeks like looking at it and kind of being like, that's me, that's weird. Like sometimes it really felt like me, other times it really didn't. So it was this sort of like both like created maybe in some ways more distance and disconnect, and then also I had to sort of try and like tell my brain like, okay, that's you, like that's what we are trying to process and trying to like integrate.
That's so interesting, because I feel like for me, that separation of the different selves, my response was to just be transparent about it and go really meta, so that throughout the book, I'm kind of embodying different roles, where it's like, here I'm trying to be the historian, hiding in objective truth. Here I am shying away from the emotional side. And then towards the end of the process, I started calling my narrator like a rogue honey badger, because she just like jumped in and started doing really weird things to the structure. And so I think that was my way of kind of handling that thing that you're talking about, where there is an artifice when you're taking an incredibly personal story and then you are creating a character and then narrating it. And I think that also ties in with why a graphic novel. I don't think you can't do that in a non-comics form. And just to touch on the last part about having work witnessed, I feel like I can speak to that so well right now, because I'm out on book tour after working on a book for 9 years, and honestly thought, like when I was planning it, I felt like I was planning my own execution. All I felt was dread, and I thought it was going to be like this awful slog of all of the parts of this that I've hated. And instead, I'm finding that now the book is like truly just out of my hands. I'm like, it's done. I'm just seeing all my friends. I'm free. I don't have to think about it anymore. And that part of it, where you finally actually just get to close the chapter and move on to the next one, it's finally making me feel that catharsis that well-intentioned people have been asking me for almost a decade if I've been feeling.
That makes me feel like very excited for that part of this process. Thanks for that, Tessa. I wanted to speak to Natalie, your comment about like two things that you said totally resonated. First, the issue of like that you're dealing with all these past selves in a way in this work, right? Like, so it's like current you making a book, then there's past you who created, like, so for me right now, I'm inking, right? So I have this manuscript I'm working from, but there's like a past me already who made that. Then there's current me making this thing. Then I'm looking at this even further past me. It gets like really complicated to like hold all of those perspectives and those me's, and also to recognize like, oh wow, like feelings do evolve about this. Erin, definitely like 100% agree. Like the book is like definitely triggering and re-traumatizing in different ways. And then in some ways, I can see like different sections of the book are like really are cathartic in a way, like not cathartic, that's the wrong word, but like are more neutral, I guess. And that's been really interesting to see. But I think the other thing that you said too, Natalie, that hit me was the part about making it beautiful, because it's a really, really odd thing where you have this hard story that you're grappling with and that you're trying to make it beautiful. And I just encountered that in a chapter that I was really struggling with. And it was like very emotional, like territory. And then creating, it ended up being this part that I felt like very good about, but like, wow, it was really hard. And it was odd because it feels like it's going to be one of the most beautiful parts of the book. And so that dissonance of like, you're making this thing look good, but it's like this really hard material, that resonates a lot. Yeah. And I'm so glad to hear that there's maybe like a different perspective of having the work witnessed than witnessing yourself, because I think the witnessing yourself part feels like maybe the most challenging part. I would love to hear what others have to say about having others witness their work and what that felt like.
And I'm curious too, if others of you encountered in a new way, or maybe for the first time, shame as you were making the book. Because one of the things that I realized in making the book was how much shame had controlled how I had been responding. And then there were other times in making the book where I really wanted to depict some of my ugliest moments, or what I was judging now to be, or had judged in the past to be, truly ugly moments. And then I felt incredible shame depicting those pages, making those pages, and then looking at myself and then thinking about, oh my God, am I going to let people see this? And the navigation of not only discovering shame where I hadn't realized it had been, then having to deal with it, then making things that I wanted to be transparent and honest, that also made me feel somewhat ashamed, and then absolutely not cutting them, and those are almost always the things people go straight to and tell me are the best parts of the book. The bravest part, the most transparent or real part is when I, sort of said, I did this thing that I'm not proud of, or I forgive myself for now. I just wondered if others of you felt yourself negotiating shame, which is, a very hard part of trauma, right?
Yeah, I would say that shame is like probably the biggest thing that I have had to navigate with this book, and especially like the putting it into the world part too. Like for me, I'd sort of the opposite experience as Tessa, where it was like um the best part was when I got my first copy in the mail and it wasn't out yet, and I could just like hold it, and I was so proud to see like all my work to come together. There's all this hope, oh, what's it gonna be like to share this story, la la la. And then the day of my book launch, it's like walking to my book launch, it's like something just like flipped in my brain. It was a beautiful event. I did it with my friend Tilly, who, she had all these thoughtful questions, and everyone, it was, and yet internally, I felt like I had stepped into a new kind of waking nightmare, totally different from everything that came up making the book. This was like, and this probably is not what you want to hear, but it was just, I think while I was working on it, there's like two parts of me. There's a part of me that's more like the artist self who, in drawing the book, I draw everything, there's explicit sex, on 90% of the pages. Not really, but it's like that comes easily to me, the making it, because that's just sort of like my artist brain, like that's how I'm processing the world, so I can easily put that down. But then there is the part of me that like lives in society and has parents and has, you know, knows that like people will feel uncomfortable, or there's just like this feeling too of like having been a really hypersexual person and then like trying to wrestle with the shame just around my own behavior, and then the shame that comes with sexual violence. And so yeah, all of that then gets put into this book that then you put out into the world. And yeah, it was really hard. And I think, you know, I've had a lot of really wonderful like messages from people who read it, and that can help sort of undo some of that shame, because it's just this reminder of like, oh, okay, we're not alone. Like there's so many girls who are out there living like parallel lives, and when you hear from them, like it can really help be the antidote. But at the same time, you know, it's like I'm always still wrestling with that. And anytime, you know, my friend just said, oh, my mom's gonna get a copy of your book, and I was like, ah. But you know, I don't know, it's like, yes, the shame is definitely something that I continue to navigate, but I don't know.
And I'm
Yeah,
seeing it.
oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Erin, go ahead.
I put shame, I mean, in the subtitle of my book, because to me, this was I wanted to take the things that I was most ashamed of. The whole reason I started this, and when I started writing this, I wrote it in the notes app of my phone, and I thought it was going to be a zine that I would like photocopy at Kinko's and then hand out to my friends. Like I had no intention of ever publishing this, but what I wanted was for it to live outside of my body. I wanted an external copy of it. I wanted to take the most painful memories and experiences that I'd ever had, and I wanted to put them on a shelf, on a literal shelf. And so like there are scenes in here that like to some, I mean, much less so now, but like still make me cringe a little bit. And that, yeah, but it does, the shame, you know, it's been 5 years since this book came out, and the shame dissolves. It really did help me. Not when the book came out, but like later on, like it became an instrument of freeing myself. And part of that, like Natalie just mentioned, like the best part of publishing a book like this, is that people read it and they reach out to me. They still reach out to me sometimes, and say, your book really helped me. Or I've been through this. A lot of men reach out to me and say, what have I done? Also, which had really surprised me. But you know, it's like that, it horrified me at first, because people would reach out and tell me like these things that were so emotionally vulnerable, and I felt like I had not earned them. Like I had not earned their vulnerability because I didn't know them. And I had to sort of, I had to rearrange my thinking a little bit, and learn to be, that's the best part. That's what I understand to be the best part now, is that like it can be part of somebody else's healing, that I can be cathartic for someone else. And that's really the reason to keep doing it. Yeah. So yeah.
I noticed that in the chat, Chris had a question about what's the rescue net for this type of vulnerability. And I think that Chris is referring to the shame. And I'm thinking that's been a huge question on my mind. It's like, how do you take care of yourself through when you're re-traumatizing yourself, experiencing this shame? I saw Beth wrote, honestly, I have a terrific therapist, 100% like, yes. In other ways, like how are you taking care of yourself through that process? And what do you see kind of like evolving over time through that process too?
I can answer that mostly as a cautionary tale, because initially when I was asked to be on this panel, I was like, oh, I would not recommend the route that I took. And a lot of that was really outside of my control, because I sold my book on proposal a couple months before COVID hit and had a tight publication deadline with a truly masochistic, like I think I had to draw a page every 1.8 days with no days off for years. During the depths of COVID, when I was living in a small town that I had moved to specifically so that I couldn't be distracted. But the fallout of that was that I didn't have good community and I didn't have peers. And so I just death marched my way through it in total isolation and got extraordinarily depressed. And if anyone reads the book, there are reasons why the usual avenues of having a good therapist were unfortunately not available. So I think you all are far ahead of where I was at by virtue of the fact that you're on this call, because you have a community of people who are doing the same things as you. And I think that's something that would have been extraordinarily helpful, was to have solidarity and other people who are in similar trenches and to have set that up in some way ahead of time. But I kind of want to go back to that shame question, because there was another element of shame that I felt, which is around monetary success for cashing in on your trauma, because that was something that I had very complicated feelings about, because essentially I had this true story in my family, and publishing is so much about, do they see a market for it? And so I was lucky in that there was a lot of interest, and my book went to auction because people were basically saying, you know, this can be the Chinese American history Persepolis, which is also the, like, as of yet unmade definitive American mixed race identity graphic novel, and therefore we can make money. And that, to me, being financially remunerated for sharing about the awful, awful darkness of what happened to my mom and grandma, threw me through a huge loop. And I feel like part of my obligation in that is to talk candidly about it, because I think publishing thrives on secrecy, and that it's better for everyone if we talk about the commercial realities and the way in which blending money and trauma is its own emotional roller coaster.
I think for me, because it was my own trauma, I didn't have any qualms about like the idea of like monetizing it, but I also didn't really think about it that way, because the publisher I went with, Fantagraphics, like they give very small advances, and so you're essentially making the book for free with a little bit of a cash bonus. And then it's been nice that now I have been able to earn royalties. So in a way, I also feel like there is this part where it feels a little like, you know, reparations, or like, you know, when you sue someone in civil court for emotional damages, it's like I do feel like the money, I mean, I think, you know, the average person who's sexually assaulted will spend around $100,000 to $200,000 throughout their life on medical and therapy and just all of the things that come with, you know, being traumatized. And so yeah, there is this sense of like, there's been so much money I've had to put into just staying alive and getting to the place where I'm able to put this book out there, that I do feel like I'm like, yeah, give it to me, you know, if it's if that's possible. I think, you know, I might feel differently if I had gotten, you know, like a huge advance, and then it's like I think that can kind of like almost like put pressure on that I just didn't have. Yeah, but then I think also there was even some shame in some ways for not getting more money, and sort of feeling like, are they exploiting me? And you know, and then it's hard to market. Like I think that's been something that has felt confusing. Like, how do you market this book? And you know, marketing's all about like, ooh, shiny, cool, like buy this, and you want to give people like fair warning of what they're like signing up for reading. Yeah.
Can I go back to your original question about taking care of yourself while you're making the work? Because I didn't do this very well with Commute, but when I wrote What's Wrong, I had a plan which is that I sold this book. I wrote this book, which is called How to Take Care, while I was working on What's Wrong. So when I was doing the second book where I had to lay bare my trauma, I pitched this book with my college best friend, Kate Novotny, who's a labor and delivery nurse and a doula. And it's literally just a book. This was during COVID, so I was making What's Wrong when I was like working out of my closet, is where my office was in my house with, totally isolated, but having this other project going that was all about, it's like a literal like A to Z. I mean, you can't see this, but it's an A to Z guide of like literally just ways that you can take care of yourself, from like castor oil packs to therapy to peer support to like going outside and eating pasta. So the second time around I definitely had a plan, and because I'm a workaholic, it was working more but on something else. So I would take like 2 months breaks in between. That's another thing that I did, is like Commute came together really slowly, and then once I sold it, it was very quick. I had to do a lot of work very quickly, which I don't recommend. And with What's Wrong, I spent years drawing it and trying to get it right. And the long breaks that I took were focused on figuring out the care part of it.
The breaks, I think that being able to, so I wanted to comment, well, I guess first I want to go briefly back to the money and then comment on breaks and taking care, because I think both of these are so important. It almost feels like that the money, I wonder if it's almost a little bit like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't with the money, because it's like you're working on this vulnerable story, and if you get paid like well for it, that feels bad in some kind of way. But also if you don't, it's also bad in some kind of way. Yeah, I'm realizing as I sit with it, it feels like maybe there's not a kind of a happy result with that. And maybe part of that is because of, definitely shame, right? And probably shame around money. The breaks, that super resonates. And I think, I know for myself, I've been working on trying to find ways to put down the book when I know I need to put it down, and not just power through, although sometimes that's a little impossible with deadlines. But having that ability to take breaks seems really, really critical for taking care.
I actually feel the exact opposite. So I think maybe it's just dealer's choice. You have to find the method that works for you. And for me, I think because the world that I had to inhabit for this book was so all-consuming, I could survive it if I stayed in it. But if I did take breaks, going back in was so much more agonizing than just forcing myself to stay, because everyone was like well-intentionally telling me that I should take breaks. And so I would like go solo backpacking for 4 days. And the instant I'm in the woods, I'm like, oh, here's myself again. It feels so good. And I would just feel this relief. And then I would go back to the studio. And like, to be frank, I would just like cry hysterically on my floor for days because it hurt so much to have to go back into this. And so the last couple of years, I literally was like, it is easier to take no breaks than to be able to like go back into this world of having a self that I recognize and then have to put it back in a cage. So to each their own.
Process is so unique in this, right? Like, I think that's what's also so fascinating to me about this whole thing.
Yeah, and I found that I would do it in chunks, and then I definitely didn't anticipate taking breaks because I do work really fast, so I'd sort of laid out a timeline of like, okay, like I can get this done in a year. But I found for me, just the way that trauma manifests for me currently is that it's like very physical. And so I would reach a point, I would often push myself too far, and I would feel that little sort of snap in the brain, and I could keep pushing, but then it would lead to just really long periods of collapse where, yeah, just like we're physically, like I remember Beth, in your book you talk about like noodle arms and noodle legs, and that's something that I think isn't talked about a lot with trauma, is just like the physical reality that, you know, it's like I would get to a point where I could barely walk, you know, and would just have to be in bed for days. And I think that had I now, as I start the second book, I want to be more aware of when I feel like I'm about to hit that point where it's going to lead to a collapse, to just stop for a little bit. Because I think if you can, if it's possible to take breaks, if you can do it sooner, you'll take a shorter one. Because when I did push myself so far, sometimes it would be months. I couldn't, and I even like, I sought out experimental therapy. I did like some MDMA sessions, because it's like I truly just hit a point where it's like I knew I will finish this book even if it kills me or makes me go insane. And yet I had to get to a point where at least I can, like, you know, move my arms and like and do it and not make it so miserable. So yeah, it was like a process of having to also just like accept I can't work right now. It doesn't mean it's done. I'm not quitting, but I have to, you know, just like trust that I will reach a point where I can come back to the drawing table.
I would love to hear about like what it's been like to have your work witnessed, like more about that, about.
I have a question for Tom. I'm wondering what it was like to have your book become a bestseller, because that seems like a very double-edged sword.
Yeah, more like quadruple-edged sword. Well, to be fair, bestseller doesn't really mean very much. Like the numbers were very, very low. And I mean, we're being transparent. I might as well be transparent. I asked my agent, I said, #1 bestseller, what does that mean? And she was like, I don't know, I'll ask the publisher. And then she came back to me, and I swear, because I tried to blank it out after she told me, I don't remember if it had sold 350 copies or 450 copies, but I know it was no more than that. And I was like, wow, that's a bestseller. So I don't know. I was so mixed up by the time the book was out. I was seeking the relief that actually had come. It was such a years-long process, and my experience that I was trying to work through was so much more acute and so much closer in time that it was kind of cool, but it wasn't that. It didn't offer that many conflicted feelings, really. And so yeah, that's really it. The sales were going back to the money really quickly, the sales were extremely modest, the advance was extremely modest. It all felt like a very modest endeavor, except for the pain of making it. But I will just real quick echo a lot of what Erin and some of the other people, and that getting feedback from other people who the book mattered to and who it helped. It mattered so much. You know, it's really, and I would get those, and I would feel so much for those people. I'd be like, God, that sounds so horrible. And they were reaching out to me saying, thank you because you helped me. And I was like, boy, I'm so sorry for your story. You know, anyway. So you'd have to find somebody with a bigger bestseller to get a better answer.
Yeah, can I say something? I've had 0 bestsellers, but at least in the graphic memoir department. And like when Commute also went to auction. I think I had a bunch of offers on it. I turned down a lot of money actually to go with a smaller publisher who I thought would make the most beautiful book. And like, I really wanted to make this beautiful shame product that I could put away. Like I wanted it to be really pretty. I wanted full color. I wanted, but which I shouldn't have done. I should have taken the money. But yeah, no, they there was all this hype, right? Like at least the publisher was like, they felt like they'd gotten this thing that they'd won, even though they'd spent less money on it. And they were like, this is going to be our lead title. And there was all this pre-publicity hype. There were these starred reviews. There was blah, blah, blah. And then it came out and it was like womp womp. Like it just like nothing happened, again, like maybe I sold 100, 200 copies the first week. I don't know how many it was, but it was, sales for both of any of my books, except for the first two, which are activity books, were and have been disappointing to everybody. And my friend, the writer Mary Carr, gave me the greatest advice that I've ever gotten about what it is to make a book. And what she told me is, you read every review one time, whether it's good or bad, you read it one time, and that is it. And she said, the day that, okay, well, this is learned experience. The day your book publishes is the most depressing day of your life. And what it does in the world is none of your fucking business. She says, once that book comes out, you have made it. You have put your heart and soul into it. What it does in the marketplace is none of your business. You have to completely detach from what happens to the book in the market. What matters are like the Instagram DMs or whatever you get from people who say, thank you so much for creating this work. It really helped me. Those are the things that matters. Everything else is none of your business. Because it will literally kill your soul if you start paying attention to sales and numbers. That is not, like, you cannot go on making work like this if you care about the consumer market. You have to detach.
Agree.
Strong agree. And also in transparency, like, you can never trust anything a publisher tells you about what they're going to do with your book. It all means nothing. Deadlines mean nothing. Promises mean nothing. And I think for me, like, as somebody who had worked as a lone wolf, I was unaware of just how dysfunctional the publishing industry is. And I don't know. That's interesting, Erin, that you say you wish you had gone for more money in a different publisher, because I actually wish that I had done the inverse. And my only friends who have had even remotely palatable experiences in publishing have all been with indies. So I think it's great on this panel. We have a bunch of different people who have gone different routes, and it's like, pick your poison. You can go with someone with more resources and you will not get to be a human being, or go with a smaller publisher who has no resources, but you actually do get to remain somebody who's actually like talking to people who have read your book and care.
Yeah, I'm definitely glad I went with a publisher that, it's like if they don't give you the money, they can't force you to complete it because they know you have to make a living. And so I had no deadline, didn't have a deadline even nearing the end. It's like it really did. I think that was something that was really helpful from a trauma perspective, to let that part be self-directed and not have someone hanging over me telling me you're doing a bad job because you're slow. It had to be like on my terms. And then yeah, it's like I felt shame around getting a small advance for a while, but now there's something really exciting about getting royalties. And I think it's like 80% of published books never reach royalties because, if you're with a big publisher, like, it's hard to earn out those bigger advances. So yeah, I think I've been happy with like the publishing side that I went with.
Can I ask a question of Tessa? I'm just asking for clarity. Are you saying you're not hearing from people who liked the book and were moved by the book? Or in what way are you currently being mistreated, or were you mistreated during the process of making it?
Oh, production and my publisher. So my editor quit 6 months before launch and nobody stepped in to care. So I was orphaned and they literally ghosted me, and my publisher just didn't speak to me at all.
Oh,
Yeah.
but
Like I literally didn't hear from anyone at my publisher when my book came out. They just no communication.
Wait, I had the same thing happen to me.
Oh, man. Y'all
I
are
don't wanna-
talking out of big
No, I've
publishers.
had for my most recent book, I've had like I'm on my third editor and my second marketing person, and yeah, my editor left like yeah, one left right before the final book files were due, and then the next one that I had left right before I published. So now I'm on number 3.
Wow, I'm seeing Tom and putting notes in the chat about can of worms, like total can of worms. Whoa. It's a lot to navigate, especially like on like right near the final deadline, Tessa. Holy crap. I guess these are like major like words of warning for us all.
I mean, just assume, and this like maybe is going to sound really cynical, but if we're talking about how to survive a graphic novel, assume your publisher is going to do nothing to support you, and then anything they do, you will be pleasantly surprised. And I think ultimately that is a healthier approach, because I kind of had this process of being like, but you guys have been telling me all along that you're going to do these things and these things are going to happen. And then none of it did. And if I hadn't thought I could trust them, I think it would have been a way less devastating process. So trust nothing.
Can I ask another question of Tessa? I'm just, again, clarity, I put it in the chat too. Can you, your book seems to be getting quite great press. So what is the support you're not getting? So it sounds like they're publicizing it. Is that?
Well, so yeah, I'll be transparent. After my editor quit, my agent told me we had to hire a freelance publicist.
Oh, wow.
That is much more what has happened. Is any book that you've heard of in the last 5 years, the author shelled out for a freelance publicist, and that comes completely out of their pocket. And it's really a pay-to-play system. And that has become the norm as publishing is consolidated. And now that they understand that anything that they pick as a lead title, the author is also basically going to have to spend their money for a publicity department, they've started withdrawing all that support. So that is just the reality of this game.
And I would add,
also the exact same thing that I had to do.
okay, and mine was very different. Small indie publisher, small, advance that I thought was appropriate given who I was dealing with and all that. And I blew through that advance my first trip to go talk on a panel somewhere. Money was gone. Right. And I'm okay with that. I mean, I made those choices. I'm not complaining. I knew that was what was going to happen. But as you guys are saying, big and small, I'm retired. Right. So I'm sitting here listening to y'all thinking how good I feel. I won't say privileged or really even lucky that I'm not doing this to make money to support myself or even trying. That takes so much pressure, I think, off of the decisions I would make if that were not the case, if things were different. Yeah. So, but I agree. Again, big or small advance, big or small publisher, you're expected to put a lot of your own money in to helping a thing succeed in the world.
I have 2 other questions for you all, and then I'd love to like open it up to just like everyone asking questions, or if you all have more questions. It feels like a super productive and like generative discussion. Okay, I'm trying to think about how to ask this without like turning it into some kind of weird toxic positivity, because that's not where I'm going with this. But I'm really curious about like when you look retrospectively now, like what were some of the best parts of the process? And I don't think that needs to be necessarily framed around like excitement or like joy necessarily, but like I think sometimes some of like so far some of the things I've experienced that I would say are the best parts of the process have also been the hardest parts of the process. But I'm curious, like I'm curious about like what does that mean for you all? And I guess related with that is like how has your book changed you? How has making this changed you?
anyone want to go? Because I can go, but my book's so different. I mean, I'll try and speak quickly. One reason I haven't talked much is I tend to go on a long time about these things. Um, I don't remember the best parts, but how to answer how the book changed me, the whole purpose of the book was to change me. Like, I knew that going in. Like I knew where I had to get to. I had to get to this part where my body understood what my brain understood, which was that my daughter wasn't coming back, and I had to find it, and I had to sort of accept a new reality. The only way it seemed possible was to make this a book about it. So to some degree, I think the book did its job, but I sort of insisted it to. But also, unlike you all, I had been drawing comics for like 25 years or something. So like I knew its power on me anyway to sort of transmute. Is that the word? Transmute emotional experiences, to sort of. So anyway, that's just. It got me to where I needed to be.
So I have this thing tacked up to my wall. I'm going to pull it down from Tom Hart. And I started my book in 17. It came out in 22. This is in 2019. Beth Trembley, he says to me, wrote to me, "Sometimes I think you're not writing a graphic memoir as much as you are rewiring your whole consciousness and preparing yourself to help others in the meantime." And oops, I froze. Did you all freeze? Did you hear that? Because you all froze. Okay, good. So obviously I wrote it down, stuck it to my wall, because that was the moment that somebody showed me what I was doing. I didn't realize that's what I was doing. And so that, Cara, to answer your question, is how that book changed me. It did rewire my consciousness, not only in my relationship to the trauma, but in my understanding of comics, communication, right? I have a new career now, basically, because of this book and the stuff that happened, because I work now entirely in comics. And to prepare yourself to help others in the meantime. Which was a big part for me. I really, really do believe in the power of graphic memoir to be much more than, and you've all done it, than telling the thing I need to tell, right? It's to do it for the purpose of bringing some sort of wisdom into the world that will help other people deal with not even the same traumas, but just their own lives, get more meaning from their own lives, understand how to navigate their own lives. And I, as someone who had been an educator for 30 years, I could have articulated that that's kind of what I was doing anyways as an educator, but I really have that kind of honed vision now for, I'm 60 now. What am I going to do with the rest of my life and my art? And for me, that is a huge part of it. Tom. Thank you, Tom.
I think there were actually like a lot of sort of best parts at different stages. Like I said, it's like my process was really like up and down. Having I think anytime I would finish a chunk, comics in a way, like for me it can almost feel like a drug where it's like you're finally getting that high. It's like reverse because you're slogging along and then you get the high as opposed to getting the high and then coming down. But yeah, it's like anytime I would finish a chunk, like I would just feel so proud of myself. And I also was serializing it on Patreon, and part of the reason I did that was I knew that if I tried to work on this in total isolation, just all of that like building up for years, I just knew that the shame would become, and the stress of then having to just drop it in whole would just be too much and it would be sort of distracting. So it really did help me to sort of like take these baby steps of, it's like I think 30 people like are reading it and half of them don't even read it, they just subscribe, which I learned later. Most people on Patreon don't even look at what you're doing. But yeah, just knowing that there were a few people, and it's like I even once I posted the sort of most traumatic chapter, I even asked people, hey, if you read this, can you just let me know? And yeah, and just even hearing like a sentence or something, just it just helped me to feel like, oh, okay, the world hasn't ended, people haven't like freaked out, you know, they still love me. Like I think that was a big thing, is I was convinced that by making this book people would stop loving me. Doesn't make sense, but that's what trauma does to your brain. And so I think also I remember Melanie Gilman, I took their memoir uh short workshop before I got into comics. That was sort of my gateway, and one of the things they said about memoir is sometimes you just have to make a story, like even if it's like a zine. And this kind of reminds me of what you were saying, Erin, is that um also to be able, it's something you might not want to explain over and over again. It's like you want to be able to tell people, but you don't want to have that conversation multiple times. And so I think creating the book, then it is something you can like give to people, or they just read it, and then there's this sense of like, okay, they actually know this thing about me, and they still want to talk to me, or they still, want to be a part of my life. So I think that was really helpful for me, and in sort of trying to undo some of that shame. And then I also mentioned like getting the first copy in the mail, like suddenly it being this physical object that you can open and close, and it has like a cover, and I wanted it to feel sort of like, yeah, like a precious object that like the outside isn't triggering. It's like the outside can be calming so that people can close it and not um be trapped in that dark world. So just having that physical copy, I feel like that like woke up my child brain that was like, I just want to make a book someday. As a kid, you don't care what it is, you just want to hold a book. And so that was the most magical part. um and then in terms of like how the process changed me, I think yeah, it changed me a lot. It can be hard to sort of identify, because it's amazing how quickly you forget where you were, a few years ago, and your relationship to the events. I think I was hoping that it would be a neater bow. Like I really wanted to get to this place even before the book came out. I was trying really hard to like just like heal. Be like, all right, I'm healed, and now the book will come out and I'll be able to like talk and not be, triggered. And the reality is like you can't put like a timeline, you can't have a deadline for your healing. And I think that I also thought that maybe more would happen when it first came out that would feel like healing. But instead it was the opposite. And now as more time has gone by, I feel like I'm starting to be like, okay, I see why having this out is helping to undo some of that shame, like Erin was saying, where it has to be gradual. And I think, yeah, it also like your relationship to the book is going to change over time. And it's a strange thing because the book stays the same, but you grow and change. And I've even before the book came out, I sort of realized some things about some of the events that I was like, oh, I wish I could go back and like change that drawing. But you have to just accept that like this is a time capsule of your understanding of these events at this moment in time, and it's going to change maybe tomorrow or in 20 years. Like I would do a totally different book about these same events. So kind of just like accepting that the book itself, it is not definitive, and in 20 years maybe you want to do another book that like clears things up, or shows like a different perspective. Or like I loved in Alison Bechdel's newest book how she talks about the impact of making fun home. And I think that that's something like as creators, like I love when they talk about what it was like to create this thing that people just sort of look at and they go, oh, mouse, it just exists, and it's like, okay, but what was that like, and what did that do to his life? And so yeah, I think it's constantly evolving.
Yeah, I love that you said that, Natalie. That's really interesting. The book that I'm working on now, is in many ways like a revision of Commute. Like it sort of starts with the question of like, what does it mean to narrativize your own history, and can you change the narrative once you've published it? Like, can the story change? Like, can I rewrite the story of my own life in this sense, to sort of give myself more agency, and what would that look like? But I wanted to say just quickly that I'm going to continue my role here as panel pessimist, and just say that like I hate writing and making. I hate it's so miserable. Like, to me, writing a book or whatever is just like banging your head against the wall. Like, I hate it. It's so painful. I do it because I am compelled to do it and because I have to do it. And it is like, it's a really miserable experience for me generally. And one where, again, like I have to take a lot of care of myself around it because it sucks. It's painful. It's miserable. And the best part of writing is having written.
Yes.
I love the feeling of having made, of having written. And so it's like the end of the day when you're like, okay, that's like a really solid 500 words, or that's, like a really solid page of art, or whatever it is. Like, that for me will always be that's the goal. To just like having but it's the process of making it, I find super painful most days.
I'm laughing because I just experienced a few weeks of telling my spouse, like, I was like, some people do like amazing drugs and then other people make books, and like I think I've made a bad life decision. Because it was like a period of like, so I didn't want to do it. I just didn't. And it felt like that. It felt like I like had to put myself like in a chair and just like do it. And I felt exactly like that, Erin. Tessa, I see you wanting to say something, I think.
Oh yeah, I felt like that for like 4 straight years. It was miserable. I hated literally every moment of it. Which is maybe why at some point you just have to sell the book and have a publishing contract, because then you can't back out. So external commitment devices are good. But to go back to your original question, I think I maybe had a unique set of circumstances in that my compulsion to tell this story was rooted in a fissure in my family's past that I sort of knew it was my duty to resolve. And I started it from a place of wanting to heal my really broken relationship with my mother. And that did happen. And I think to me, that's part of why I've been completely indifferent to any of the actual book related part. Because I thought at the outset that I would never get what I most wanted, which was for my mother to be able to see the love and compassion that I held for her. And then through the course of working on this, it really did transform our relationship, and she saw that. And so I think the biggest change and the most like heartbreaking gift that I'm now receiving from this is my mom has dementia, and it went off a cliff. She had a stroke basically as all the pre-launch stuff for my book was happening. And so the point where I was like, I'm free of this 9-year burden, it was like yanking me back, because now I'm my mom's power of attorney and I'm managing her life kind of from afar. But in moments of lucidity, we were able to talk about the fact that if she had entered this chapter of decline without me having just given almost a decade of my life to working with her to tell this story, it would be so much harder and so much more agonizing, because it brought us to a place of trust. So I don't know, I think, Erin, I give you a run for your money on like the panel pessimist, but I do think that is it's probably the most extraordinary gift I've ever received from anything I've ever done.
Yeah, I want to say something else about that, which is like that in making What's Wrong, which is the book that has other people's stories. Like I getting to share the stories of Dee, Alex, Rain, and Adriana, who are the other people in this book, was an exceptional gift. Like, I think, and something that was super, super meaningful to me. I think it's writing about my own shit that's hard. And like, there was so much more reward I found in writing, in doing something for somebody else.
I'm seeing a comment from Kate in the chat, saying, but Cara, more than anyone, I've heard you talk about the joy of the process of making your book. Just that one section seems like it was very painful, or maybe more than that. And I want to say that I think it's like a yes and thing. Like, I've found like the parts so far that have made me like want to quit are the parts that like feel like triggering and like traumatizing. But then also after that, it feels like the best part in some way because I got through it and because I think like Natalie was saying earlier, like I made it beautiful in this weird way. But that dissonance, like holding that dissonance is really hard. And like being in it, like Erin was saying, like when you were like in the thick of it, like that I just felt so much resistance to that part.
I also think there's something that is really nice about having total control over how you draw something. And for me, I do love to draw. Obviously, like sometimes you get in a place where it's like you're like, ugh, I don't want to be forced to draw, but there is like joy always in that creation. And I think that's what was also strange is that when I draw, and especially when I draw people, it's impossible for me not to sort of love them a little bit. And so then in terms of like drawing like assailants and like people who did horrible things to you, it's this strange thing where I mean, I hate the concept of forgiveness, or like I think it means different things to different people. But I do think that there is something about drawing even like the worst moments that kind of imbued them. And now I sound like the crazy like panel la la optimist lady, but it sort of like imbued it with almost like a sense of love. And yeah, so I think like even though it I would have those like collapses and freeze, like there was this sense that like at the same time a lot of the creation was weirdly joyful at times. And I think that's why, yeah, like I like to work traditionally and feel like I'm still in that sort of like fine arts mindset of like painting and creating something that can be just like a visual fun experience. And also, yeah, I think when you do work about trauma, at least like for myself, I felt almost like this weird compulsion that I had to kind of like earn the readers, like if I'm gonna make them suffer, I have to make it worth it for them, so I have to give them something in return. And for me that was making it like aesthetically beautiful to look at, which I think can also be disturbing. But yeah, I felt like there was this need to almost like give them something if I was going to subject them to the darkness.
I'm seeing Carol ask in the chat about, can anyone talk about their critique groups and trauma? And I don't know if, Carol, you want to expand on any more specifics, but, or if anybody wants to address that.
I will talk about that. So I am finishing an MFA right now in creative nonfiction, which is just writing and not, anyway, I think group feedback is really hard. First because nobody ever agrees. You always get a lot of opinions. It's like there's a meme about this where it's like a cake or a pizza, and like one part of it has like a rotisserie chicken and the other part of the pizza has like rainbow sprinkles, and it's like it's that. It's just, it doesn't really you by the end of the feedback sesh, you get so many different opinions, it's hard to know which direction to go. And it can be helpful, but I don't know. I've also been asked in feedback really insensitive questions. I always prefer to have one or two trusted readers. And I seek feedback when I get stuck and I have no other recourse. And then I go to one person. And the next time I get stuck, I go to somebody else. But I think for me, like, it's more about learning to trust yourself and your vision for a work. And that can be really, really hard. It's hard not to constantly want feedback, approval, validation, and support. But for me personally, like I've found that it can be more distracting than it's worth. But I will, like, once I've completed a draft of something, I will send it around to, like a couple of trusted folks.
Yeah, it was similar. It was I started my book in as my thesis at CCS, and it was a point in the year where crits had become like optional the second half of the year. And so for me it was just like a hard no on any group feedback. Didn't want I just didn't want to share it at that point. And also my process was very I like worked out of order, and so I had my friend Daryl, who was my advisor, but we were already kind of friends, and I had chosen her because I wanted someone who I already knew her and trusted her, and she was basically just there to kind of read what I had and tell me where there might be holes, sort of be that external eye. But I also didn't even want that much feedback from her in terms of like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you did it this way? It's like, no, like it had to come straight from my brain onto the page. And I think like I can see places where it's like, oh, I bet if I'd had more of a hands-on editor or something, like maybe something would have been tighter or whatnot. Because also my editor like is super hands-off, really just like copy edited it, and then also had a couple moments where he's like, oh, is this what's supposed to be happening? Maybe clarify. But yeah, I think it's such a vulnerable thing to make these stories, and I knew that if I was getting any kind of external feedback from peers when I wasn't done yet, it would just not be helpful to me. And I liked sharing it on Patreon because then it had this sense of like, okay, I have put it into the world in a tiny capacity, but I wasn't getting any feedback from them. I didn't, it was just like, you get to read this, don't insult it. Yeah, so I think it is a hard thing when I see students bring these kinds of stories to school when they have to sort of have mandatory crits and just like navigating getting feedback.
I feel like also for me, I didn't get much feedback because a lot of what I'm doing is a long game, and my book requires holding broader context to sort of understand what's going on structurally, so that excerpting it, like it's just like you either have to read the whole thing if you're going to give critique on it or nothing. And so I just like, I was a cat that dragged myself under the porch to die alone.
I love that metaphor. And also like, oh, how. I will say at this point of my book, it's been Well, I will say like at 2 points. So 2 points, I've been noticing like how like much I need feedback. One was when I had the beginning of a manuscript put together before I pitched it, before it was like a full-fledged thing or even like really fully envisioned in my mind. I started to get stuck because it was such a lonely process. And I also started to get stuck on like what I was imagining it looking like. And that is actually when I joined Sequential Artists Workshop. And I could not have gotten this far without everybody. And then I think the other point I noticed was like earlier when I started to ink the book, and have these like really deadlines, I started to realize like, oh shit, like there's these points where I come up to pages where I'm not like, I don't have a good vision for them or not satisfied with them. And I think because I'm only sharing like little pieces, it's felt good to share that with a big group and to get that feedback. And I really like feel like it's made a huge difference. Like I couldn't have some of these things I think I would have been like stalled out for like days or weeks to try to figure out how to go forward. And then I've also been like really, really fortunate to have a very small critique group of people who can look at the work and look at it without look at it as the work and less about the stories behind it. And that feels like so therapeutic in some kind of way and like healing in one way and also like artistically like really beneficial to be able to look at those stories. And like I think because we're working on like similar kinds of stories, to be able to look at that work together and get like I trust them a lot. But I think
Yeah.
that can be
A
like
really similar story for me. And I think because I was so brand new to comics and feeling that I would throw things up a lot with very specific directed questions. Like, you guys, I'm trying to figure out how to make this happen visually. Here's what I've done. What do you think? Can you help me? And so like when I would show bits, it would always, I believe very much in directing my group to talk about what I want them to talk about. And, you know, Natalie touched on that and others as well. I don't care what you think about this and that, because I'm not looking at that right now, right? Just this. But then I identified, once I realized there was going to be a book that I figured I was going to self-publish 10 copies, if nothing else, right? I identified early who I thought I wanted to be my beta readers, basically. And I contacted them and said, I would like to save you to comment on the whole book for feedback at some point if you're willing. And therefore, I'm not going to show you another thing, because I didn't want them to see anything in process. So that when, as Cara was just saying, they got a manuscript of the book as a whole later, it was just about the work, not about the iterations or the struggles and so forth. And that, again, that helped me a lot. Yeah. But I think taking control, as, and all of you described yourselves doing it, but I don't think a lot of people know that they can take control of the feedback. I want to hear what works. I want to hear, you know, only about whatever, you know, don't only talk to me about my dialogue, whatever it is, but taking control of what it is you need to help with in the moment, it can really make feedback a lot more valuable, at least for me.
One thing I also really wanted during the process was a group of people who were doing memoirs about trauma, because you know, at CCS, like, I'm surrounded by cartoonists, all my friends are cartoonists, and yet there wasn't really anyone who'd done specifically like a memoir that felt like it got into trauma in a similar way. And so I felt super isolated throughout that process. So I think like I didn't want a crit group. I kind of wanted like a support group, like a trauma memoir support group. And ironically, like now I've made all these connections after the book has come out. So I think like I'll be much better set up going into the second book. But yeah, definitely that was more of what I was looking for and was sort of searching for so desperately, and then ended up, you know, it comes together after the book was published.
Natalie, I totally second what you just said. I did have a depressing memoir support group with 2 friends, but neither of them were comic artists. But all of us were working on like multi-general things about Asian history with like mass slaughter and mental illness. And so we just like, we didn't even really talk about our books. We just drank wine over Zoom and we're like, why are we doing this to ourselves? But kind of adjacent to critique groups, I think something that is really was helpful for me was at the other end of the process where like publishing is so opaque and so much of it is just so dysfunctional, where I think comics artists and writers really, they're the only ones who are giving useful information and the ability to like ask people like, hey, how did you do this part when navigating the publication side? My agent gave me like half a dozen examples of graphic novel proposals that she'd sold. And it was super helpful for me to get to see like ones that had been written for books that were then published, so I could read those books and then go see like what was the earliest iteration of how this was sold. So I just wanted to offer that as something kind of adjacent.
That was a great tip. I think that resonates a lot too, that like oftentimes like it's not even like the work maybe that you need feedback on, but it's like that you're slogging through this, and to like know that like you're seen through that somehow, that you're gonna like survive that process. Yeah. I would love to open it up to like, if anybody in the audience has questions and wants to ask the panelists questions. I'm seeing a question from Judith: is having an agent necessary?
That didn't have one, right?
Oh, yeah, I didn't have one either.
You neither.
Yeah, no, I will say, just to go back to what y'all were saying about support groups and stuff, that when I did submit and had an offer from a publishing company, I very swiftly realized I had to get an attorney. And I reached out to other comics artists who don't have, just said, who doesn't have an agent who has a good attorney? And within literally probably 90 minutes, I had people who I had never met before offering up, experiences and names of good representation, so that for the contract stuff, because I didn't feel secure doing that myself. And so the support of the transparency of the comics community and the willingness of comics artists to help each other has overwhelmed me from the start. So I don't think you need an agent. I do think you need an attorney, unless you feel secure doing that stuff yourself. But yeah, at least that was
Can I say something also? Just speak. Is that
Sure.
okay.
Yeah.
I also had a career my whole life as a painter, as a writer, doing all this stuff, and I did a what got called a graphic memoir of something by kind of accident. I kept what do you call it? I kept a journal, and then I have pictures, and 30 years after the event, it got published by Penn State Press, Graphic Medicine. I didn't even know Graphic Medicine existed. I met another artist who saw my book that I had published myself and said, oh, you should go see graphic memoir people. So it was kind of accidental, only I don't believe in coincidence. I want to tell all of you how valuable this evening was. It was unbelievable, this class. And the fact that you all took care of yourselves enough to do this when you were younger is really impressive. I mean, I'm working on a graphic memoir now, and I had to wait for everyone in my family to be dead before I could even think about doing it. And the whole issue of, is it privacy or secrecy? That whole, I mean, I feel like I invented the wheel on my own and then discovered that there's this whole glorious community of people who are doing it. And it's very reassuring. But I want to give you all a great, I don't know, toast for having done it and having what you know about yourselves because of it. I think you're going to be able to live your lives great because of that. I had to wait a really long, I mean, I lived a good life, but I feel like I'm just learning now how to do it. Just now. It took so long. So congratulations, everybody, really.
Thanks, Judith.
Yeah, thank you. It's never too late. But just to quickly go back to the agent question, because I think it really depends what your goals are. And that is something that I feel really strongly about, is like, know going into it what you're trying to get out of making a book. Like, if you just need to tell your story and it doesn't matter to you what format that comes out in, like, steer clear of mainstream publishing, it's horrible. But I think for me, I'm sort of in, again, a little bit an odd position, because I'm much more in traditional literary publishing than I am in comics and graphic novels. So I'm with a big 5 publisher that I'm their first graphic novel. And, you know, right now I'm out on book tour, and I think I'm doing like 22 events, and 3 of those are in conversation with graphic novelists, and everyone else is with writers. And so I think, like, if you're doing something where your ambition or like the nature of what you're working on means that you can sort of pass through the gatekeeping of mainstream literary world, and it's putting you in the big 5. My agent is the only person I trust in this whole process. And agents are paid on commission, so they have your back because it's in their best interests. And I absolutely 100% could not have survived my process without my agent. So as I think you're learning from this panel, everyone charts their own path. And I think there are really circumstances where if you are in the big 5, it is pretty crucial to have an agent.
Thank you.
I think it might be important to follow up on what you're saying, Tessa, to clarify too that there are going to be publishing houses you just can't get to without an agent. So there are certain ones that you can pitch on your own, and then there's the ones that you can't without it. And so that's actually like a decision I'm kind of wrestling with now, because I'm also working on a second book, and which is wild. Like, why am I doing that to myself right now? But that I am going to be looking for an agent because of a lot of the things that Tessa said, and because I know that depending on where I want that to go, and depending on like the audience, I'll need an agent to do that.
So for people who want to get something published, say, they need to find an agent who then helps them find somebody. But the application to agents is its own difficult application thing, from what I know. I mean, I know a lot of people who are in the art world or publishing world, et cetera. And it seems like it's constant hoops. So the whole self-publishing thing becomes very, in some ways, liberating. I know, you know, people hire someone to do the distribution, and you hire someone to, you know, it gets taken care of. It seems like there's a lot of options for people to do well without dealing with the big shots, kind of.
Yeah, and just to talk about agents, I would say 90% of the people I know with agents found them because someone they knew made a personal introduction. And like cold querying, sometimes you'll get in with one, but you know, if you meet someone with an agent who's doing similar work to you, like they're going to open those gates for you. So it makes it both kind of better and worse in that sense. And Tom, I see your question, did my freelance publicist line up those events? So I'm working, so I have my publicist with FSG, and he and I actually have a good working relationship. And I've lived a very weird non-geographic life. So I know like 8 million people everywhere. And so I'm just using book tour as an excuse to see all of my friends. So I just tell my publicist at FSG, this is where I'm going, this is who I can read with because they're my buddy, and these are the bookstores they recommend. And then he'll do the footwork on that, but I'm kind of directing the big picture.
Yeah, and with agents, I cold queried like, 19 or something. I think I heard back from one. So it definitely, in hindsight, I'm like, oh, no one should do that. Like you have to ask around. I think the thing is most of my friends do work for younger audiences, so I was having a hard time finding agents who are even interested in like adult graphic memoirs, although obviously they exist. And then with like my publisher, like you don't need an agent, but you do you would have to have like some connection. Like I had met my editor before at an industry day through CCS, and I know like Fantagraphics has open submissions, but I later learned that in the 30 years they've been open, they've taken 2 from just total like cold query submission. So it is the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, you have to be able to network or find some in or get an agent, and often then to get an agent, like you have to also have networked. So luckily the comics community is so open and friendly. But yeah, it's hard to do it just like on your own.
I have a really great plug, which is that comics artists often don't think that artist residencies are for them, and that is not true. And all of you should be applying to artist residencies, because if people are looking at 600 righty applications and then they see pictures, you're like already ahead of the game. And artist residencies are a huge part of why I know so many amazing makers in so many disciplines all over the country. And Story Knife in Alaska, it's writers only open to women. It's incredible. If anyone wants to talk artist residencies, like feel free to message me individually, because I totally proselytize about they're like the best on every measure, and you meet really useful connections through it.
Another tip for, like, I recommend if you're looking for an agent, if you look at the acknowledgments of writers that you admire, like at the back of their books, or comic artists working on similar stories in a similar vein, like go see who their agent is, because they'll thank them in the back of their book, or look at their website and contact comics people. In my experience, like even the ones who you think are really successful are really excited to hear from other people, and you can contact people, like DM people on Instagram or whatever, and just be like, hey, can you tell me about your experience working with your agent? Like, do you like them? I was thinking about reaching out. And sometimes they'll even offer to introduce you. But find the agents who are, like, you'll know already that they're interested in the kind of work you're doing if you're finding some, you know what I'm saying? You're finding them through similar work. So get crafty in how you approach people. I find that submitting like cold calling agents through their like submissions form on their websites and stuff it's like a low yield activity. It's really, like many industries, like publishing is like 90% nepotism. So you have to forge connections, as Tessa was saying, and yeah, and find your sort of path in. But other makers, like comics people, writers, artists, like know how hard it is, and so many people helped them and continue to help them get done what they've gotten done, and they're always willing to help, in my experience. Like, so it's worth sort of, we all rely on each other for these kinds of things, so don't feel ashamed in reaching out to people and asking.
This is all such great advice. Chris is asking in the comments, is it weird when people you know in real life read your book, or do you just get used to it, or not a thing? And then Tom, you replied and said, yeah, I got used to it, tried to learn to not deflect appreciation. I'm wondering if you all want to comment on that.
Someone gave me the really good piece of advice that when someone is complimenting you, it is not about you, it's about them. And your job is to make a graceful landing for whatever it is they're giving you. And you just get used to it.
I love that.
Yeah, I like that. It definitely is weird, and I naively sort of thought that most people, like my parents' friends and stuff, like people in the community, that would have known me when I was younger. Like, I remember going to some Christmas thing, and like people like, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm in grad school for comics. And they're like, what the hell was that? You know, I was like, oh, good, no one will ever read my memoir. Turns out that's not true. Even people who don't read comics, when they know someone that in real life has published a memoir, they're out there reading it. So that did take me by surprise. But then I was also surprised at how sort of uneventful that was, even given like the sort of like vulnerability or like explicitness of my book, people sort of, I think that that's just what they want from memoir. And so it was more of like my own discomfort having to like navigate that and just get used to it. And sort of, I mean, I think in a way you start to compartmentalize and just say, God, I never would have wanted that person to read it, but they did. And, you know, you learn to like accept it. And yeah, and that it, I think with people who know you well, like family, there's more of like a navigating, like, and I think it's fair to even request that they not read it. And I've had family members say that they don't want to read it, and that's fine. And then family who has read it, and it's, you know, been sort of like a big thing to have to then like sort of process their reaction. And I think something to think about is like, depending on who's in the book that you're making your memoir about, thinking about whether or not you'll show it to them before it comes out. And are you showing it to them at the draft stage? And if you are you showing it to them with the openness that they can give feedback and say, hey, I don't want to be shown doing this? Or are you just saying, I want you to see this, but this is my story and I'm not going to make changes? And for me, I sort of navigated that differently with different people. But basically, anyone I felt like I wanted to really safeguard the future relationship, I showed or talked to about it in some capacity. People who I don't have a relationship with and don't want one, I didn't let them know I was doing it. And then I didn't really give them much leeway on whether or not that they could suggest changes. I think I was like somewhat open, but I definitely did come into it saying more like, if you don't like this, I can obscure your identity more, but it is part of what I'm doing.
Can I ask a question about, I know we're talking a lot about like kind of like the commercial also aspect of comics when you're doing something so sensitive that is trauma related. But I have a very different perspective because I live in Canada, so there is grant system. So I've been successful so far, not getting a publisher or agent, but I've been getting grants to write my graphic novel. So I'm just wondering if like at all any of you rely on that system, because I think it shifted a lot how I relate to my work.
I can speak to that. I had to get a lot of grant funding, which is part of why this book took me 9 years, because after my grandma fled China, she wrote a memoir, but it was never translated into English. So I had to commission a translation of a 280-page book. I had to do 2 research trips to Hong Kong and China. I was over there for 3 months. And so all of that was grant funded. And I think there's less funding in the US. And actually, that was one of the beautiful things that came out of it, is because those grants came with like public benefits. You have to do some sort of event around it. So for the translation one, I put together a panel discussion about loss of language and sort of what it means when you lose access to histories, when you can't read them. And the process of, I think if it hadn't been for those grants, I wouldn't have had to do so much in progress work of the graphic novel. And that was actually, I think, ultimately a good thing. But I think like I still felt all of those same complicated, you know, oh, I'm getting money for this story, and it feels so, but it did. It's the only reason I was able to do the book.
I've never gotten a grant. And I have basically like what I ended up doing was I had a career in healthcare that I left right after Commute came out. but I did it nights and weekends is how I wrote all of my first like 5 books. And then the way that I wrote What's Wrong is by selling other more commercial books that paid for me to do the book that I wanted to do, which I knew wasn't going to make me any money.
Also nights and weekends and summers, but I taught most summers. I taught summer school in order to make the money to sink in so that I could try to retire early, which was, you know, my plan for decades was to retire as early as I could so that I could work on the stuff I wanted to work on, but otherwise the same, nights and weekends.
Yeah, I'm making my book at like 5 a.m. and at like 1 p.m. It sort of bookends the day in a weird way. And that's actually been like pretty challenging to like start the day that way and then finish the day that way. It doesn't feel like restful, especially going to sleep afterwards, I think is hard. Yeah, I've been developing like rituals around that. I wanted to go back to this question of like talking about, well, 2 things. So I noticed I missed another question in the chat. Onetta, I hope I'm saying your name right. Did anyone ever have huge cries before or after drawing something in particular? And I was going to say like, oh yes. And like more like huge flashbacks. Yeah, definitely trauma symptoms from working on this. I wanted to open up that question to everybody and then also come back to this question of like, yeah, how, Tom, I thought I saw you about to say something about, is it weird when people, you know, in real life read your book? But those 2 questions too.
Yeah, no, I think Tessa's answer about that was great. Just, you know, just learn to accept that. I mean, that's what I had to learn, you know, like I'd rather be like, no, don't read it, you know, just hide. And as far as the big cry, I think everybody in the chat agreed that with just a big emphatic yes, you know. I don't know if more detail is needed, but I don't think.
I didn't cry. I learned to totally dissociate.
Me too.
Yeah,
I only cried before, like never. I would like cry when I had to force myself to go to work, but I never cried at work.
yeah, it's really hard for me to access those kinds of emotions. Like crying, it doesn't come easily, but it was much more of going into like dissociation and freeze states and like shut down. I wished I could cry, actually. I wanted to cry.
Yes.
It makes me so fucking mad that I can't just like let it out, you know, and it's like a tear will come out. And yeah, occasionally it happens, but it's so rare. And often as soon as I'm like aware that I'm like really crying, something shuts off and it peters out.
I would go to bed. 1 o'clock in the afternoon, doesn't matter, right? I would just, there were times when I would just put my head right down on the desk and cry, but I don't cry a lot. And for me, it was mostly like what you said, sort of that shutdown. I didn't feel frightened. I just was so exhausted. I could not lift my pen again. And I would go sleep, which I know is, you know, a response.
It's been interesting to me to see how my responses have changed through this process, because when I was making, like sort of making this story, which feels different from this part of the process that I'm in, sometimes I'd have like these really intense responses and literally just like need to put it down and go lay on the couch, like definitely like checked out, tired, exhausted from it, like essentially need to go and like dissociate from it. And then now this time around, I'm finding, I don't know, it's really fascinating. Like, it's like, sometimes maybe it's because of comics too, where you're looking at this page, working on this page, and like, I'll find myself like really focused on this tiny panel, and like feeling what's happening in that panel so much. And it's almost like when I can allow that, it feels like some relief from it. Like Natalie, you're saying, like, if you can get to the crying, like it feels so good. And I think that's like, the more I try to do that, the more helpful it is. But it's just the weirdest thing. I took a picture the other day, like on my iPad as I was drawing, because I was like, wow, why is it this one little moment that's like making me feel so much? And it's like, then you zoom out, and I don't know what that is, but like, it's like looking at the panel, then looking at the whole page, then like looking at the whole story. It's such a strange process. It's like magical and wild.
This has made me remember a way that I try and access emotion is to get songs that like feel like they capture the emotion of that moment. And so I think I probably cried more listening to maybe a song on repeat and like maybe looking at what I had already done than yeah, just doing it's like you need that like lubrication and to put you back in the moment on like a different level than just looking at your own drawings.
I'm curious what it's been like, or what was it like when you were telling people about that you're like making this book? Did you have like a blurb that you developed? Like what was that experience like? Like an elevator pitch? Or I know I'm asking because I noticed for myself that I have almost like a content warning that I give people. And then I kind of wait and see if they want more, and then I tell them more. But I'm kind of curious about people's process around that.
So for me, I'll just jump in to say, I was in my mid to late 50s when I started talking about this, and everybody just gave me these humongous smiles. Like, here is this gray-haired lady who's been teaching, literature since she was 25, who's now making comics. And they didn't care what my book was about. They were just so excited that I was excited about this whole new genre, just talking to people, especially my academic colleagues who, are very supportive, but also sort of like mystified, like, wait, what? You're doing what? Right? They, and at least in my world, because of my background, very few people paid attention to the content of what I was doing. They were just so thrilled to be talking to somebody who had retired from teaching to make comics. So.
I never did. Sorry, Natalie.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I never got good at saying what it was about. And to this day, I can barely even say the title since it was actually the name of my daughter. So I never got pithy about it and still can't.
Yeah, I also like have never figured out exactly the way to frame it. I feel like it's like different every time. It used to be a lot more vague, and I think there were a lot of conversations I would have with like strangers that I would just become incredibly cryptic. And it's a memoir about life, it's like, well, yeah, that's what a memoir is. Or sort of like weird, like, oh, it's about friendship, that's and even when we first got on this call and you're like, describe your book, and I'm like, oh, right, that thing that I have to do, that it's still, I should make an elevator pitch and just repeat it.
I think I did end up with an elevator pitch because I had to write so many grants for this. And so I had my 2-word version, my 150-word version, and my 350-word version, all of which were like far too polished because I had to do it so much. But I would say, like, for the last 4 years of it, I would just avoid saying I was working on a book because I didn't want to talk about it. So evasion.
Yeah, I usually crack a joke. I'm just like, well, it's my entire sex life in my 20s. Or like, it's just a bunch of, I won't say the word, but I usually, depending on who the audience is, or if I'm talking to other sober people, I'll be like, oh, it's my 5th step with pictures. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's a sex inventory. But yeah, I usually crack a joke.
I'm noticing the time, it's 3. Thank you all so very much. This is incredible. Like, it's just been I feel like, I don't know, I don't have a word, and I wish I had a comic about it. Maybe I'll make a comic about it. Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to be here and sharing what you've learned from your experience with all of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Cara. Good luck.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. Can't wait
Good luck
to
to everybody on your current tour or next book or everybody's, it seems like everybody's got a next book except Tessa. Right. Yeah. More.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. I feel like this is definitely something I wish that I had been a part of, earlier in the process just to get to have these conversations. So I think it's really awesome that you set this up. And thanks, Tom, for making Saw.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Cara.
Thanks,
All right.
Tom, everybody.
So much for putting this together. And just because I am like on the road for the foreseeable future, there's a good chance those of you in the US, I'm going everywhere on book tour. So there's my schedule.
Oh, awesome.
Yay.
Yeah, and if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to send me a message. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Cara. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
That was great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fabulous, y'all.
Thank you.
So much. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you, Cara, for organizing that. That was amazing.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really great. Unmute. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.